I live on in the flesh, this will mean more fruit for my labor, yet what I shall choose I cannot tell. For I am hard-pressed between the two, having a desire to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you. And being confident of this, I know that I shall remain and continue with you for all your progress and joy of faith, that your rejoicing for me may be more abundant in Jesus Christ by my coming to you again. And this probably, among all the sections in Philippians, is one of the most quoted, at least one or two of the verses there, and probably some of the most favorable of all the sections because of what Paul is saying about death in this passage. So we're going to get to that in just a moment. So I think we have 4 questions in total. Let's tackle question number 1 to get us through verse 19, and then we'll talk about some of the side questions we have embedded within this. All right, question number 1. What does Paul believe will be the result of their prayers? What is he expecting to happen as a result of their prayers? Chapter 1, verse 19. What 2 things are part of Paul's formula for fulfilled requests from God? And do you think it's easy to deny the importance of one or the other, or maybe even both of what he's talking about? And then at the last, we're going to talk about how important it is to have faith in our prayers and why that's so important. So what about this? What is Paul expecting will be the outcome of their prayers? What's he expecting here? What is it? Okay, salvation. So in verse 19, he says, I know that this will turn out for my... Now, one translation may have salvation, the other deliverance. The question is, what's he talking about there? Okay. It certainly could have the dual meaning here, that even if things don't work out with the trial and his imprisonment, that his salvation is going to certainly be accomplished in Christ Jesus anyway. But he also could be talking about, initially, the trial itself. So he could be talking about that. So there have been a lot of variations on this. Some people think he's talking about just the preaching of the gospel, the spread of the gospel, that it's going to work out for the furtherance of the gospel. But I think what Joel said is probably true, that either he's going to be delivered from prison, or if not, it's still going to work out in that he'll gain heaven as a result of that. I think it's easy to read this verse and kind of skip over this part because we're so interested in the deliverance part of it. When he says in verse 19, he says, I know that this will turn out for my deliverance. Is he 100% sure of that? He is 100% sure. What he's not 100% sure of is when it comes to the trial, perhaps before Caesar or his imprisonment, he doesn't know with infallible knowledge what the end result of that's going to be. So there's sort of a human confidence in that, but he knows with absolute infallible confidence about the end of it all based on their prayers and how he's been living. I do think it's interesting when you study the apostles. Some people think the apostles had infallible knowledge of every single aspect of their own personal lives. Is that true? When they were infallible, what was their infallibility? What was the area of infallibility? Okay, in the message, right? When they were presenting the message, they were 100% infallible in the presentation of the message. There would be no mistakes in that. But human knowledge is just exactly what it was. There are times when they didn't know things and it wasn't revealed to them. And they could only have the same level of confidence toward things that you and I have toward things because they didn't know the end of it all. So they were inspired men only in the sense that they were infallible in their presentation of truth, but he had a confidence, right, in what he believed would happen and was certain of the ultimate end of it all. And his confidence was based on 2 things in this passage, and these are very important things. What are the 2 things that he based this level of knowledge, this level of confidence on? Okay, one was the supply of the Spirit. There's another thing here. Through your prayer and the supply of the Spirit. So there's 2 things involved in the accomplishment of this confidence, right? One was the prayers of the saints, and the other was the supply of the Spirit. So let's talk about the prayers of the saints real quick. Obviously, he had been praying for them, because remember back, I think it was 2 weeks ago, back in verse 3, he said, I thank my God upon every remembrance of you, always in every prayer of mine, making request for you all with joy. So obviously Paul was praying for them, but what was also true? they were praying for Paul too. So he was praying for them constantly, and they were praying for him constantly. So both of them were praying for each other. And clearly in verse 19, they'd been praying for Paul. I don't know that we're as good at this as we need to be. And we all have our reasons why we don't do it as often as we should. But was Paul afraid to ask for prayers from his brethren? Are we often afraid to ask for prayers from our brethren? We don't often ask for prayers, but Paul was very open about his need for prayers, and he often did so. He would often ask for prayers from fellow Christians. He did it in almost every letter. He mentions how before writing the letter, he had asked them of prayers. Romans 15, verses 30 to 32, he was asking for prayers from the Romans, from the Christians in Rome. 2 Corinthians 1, verse 11, he asked for prayers from those in Corinth. In Colossians 4 and verse 3, he was asking for prayers from the people in Colossae. And in 1 Thessalonians 5, verse 25, he was asking for prayers from people in Thessalonica. This is a thing that Paul did quite often. I didn't put this in my notes, and we won't stay long on this, but why don't we ask for prayers as often as Paul asked for prayers from his brethren? What do you think? For some reason, we don't ask. Paul was all the time asking for prayers. We don't often do it. I saw Joel and then Gloria. Okay, so if it's a fault, I would agree with that. We're embarrassed to ask somebody for prayers, and yet in James 5 and verse 16, the Bible tells us to do what? Confess our faults and ask for prayers so that we can be healed as a result of that. And so we have Bible advice telling us that when we're now, if I'm struggling with something, I can ask for prayers from the whole church, or I can find somebody to confide in and say, please pray for me. A confidant, somebody I know that's going to help me in their prayers. But we need to be asking for prayer. So that's one reason. Gloria, did you have a different one?
I was just going to say, a lot of times we don't want people to know what's going on in our life.
Yeah, we're so privatized in our life. And I understand, right? Because you just want to live your life, and I just want to live my life. We want to be left alone. But the church is different, right? It's not the world, and it's not even the government, right? The church is different because it's family. And we should be able to reach out to each other and say, hey, pray for me. Even if it's not a fault, we should reach out and say, hey, I've got a job interview this week. I need your prayers. I want you praying for me. Hey, I've got some family issues going on. I need your prayers this week. And I think we need to be more open with that, because Paul was certainly open with his life with brethren. And I just think we should be. Bobby, I saw your hand too.
I was just going to say there could be a bit of pride there also, because like if you're struggling financially, struggling with anything, you don't want to let people know that you have.
Yeah, that I've made a mistake, or that I'm not. And the pride, if it could come down, we're not made weak by asking for prayer. We're actually made strong by asking for prayer. Okay, so that's one part of the formula, right? So if we're looking at life goals, especially in the context of seek first the kingdom of God and His righteousness, and Paul's thinking, I know that this is going to work out for my salvation, and I know it, number one, because you've been praying for me. Then if we don't ask for the prayers of saints, we're missing out on part of the formula that leads to success in life, okay? So that's part of the formula. The other half of it, oh, sorry, Gloria, go ahead.
I was just going to say, a lot of times we don't have the faith that we need that the prayer's going to be answered.
Okay, and that's the other half of it, because what's the other part of it? The supply of what? The Spirit, which is God's part of it, and I think that's exactly what you're talking about, because on one end, either we're not asking for the prayers, or we believe that when we're praying in the end, God may not actually do something about our requests, and it's sort of failing on both ends of that. So I think what you said, Gloria, is absolutely true. Tom?
You used we're afraid to ask for it. I don't think that's necessarily so. I think reluctance is a good
Reluctance.
reluctance. And I know that and have known of instances where people share their problems and they get spread all over the country, and that's not.
And it shouldn't be the case it shouldn't be the case. Right. And even if you don't tell the church, you can ask for prayers from people that you know are confidants that are going to.
But it happens.
It does happen. It does happen. And that's not your fault for asking for prayer. It's the fault of the person who would abuse your asking for prayer. They're abusing the privilege of being asked for prayer. But it does happen. Okay, so you've got on one end prayers of saints, and the other end the supply of the Spirit. And I think it's easy to fall in the trap of abusing either one of those, or maybe both of those. One, in not asking for prayer, or not even praying. Sometimes people fall in the trap of not praying, or falling into bad habits of prayer, but in some way it's just the prayer itself that's failing. Or on the other end, it could be that it's our faith in God's ability to answer prayer, that we lose our confidence in God's ability to answer the prayer, or that God's not really doing anything about our prayers. And if that happens, then the formula fails, and then the results stop as a result of that, right? So the results end on that. And I think all of that is centered in faith in prayer. And I think, Gloria, you mentioned it earlier, but how important is faith to prayer? All right. So in James 1, when he's talking about you're going through trials and you have all these various and diverse temptations, he says, faith works its patience, and patience have its perfect work. You may be a more perfect man. And then he says, let him ask in faith, as a part of that passage, and let not the person who's double-minded think that he'll receive anything from the Lord. And the idea is that if we don't have faith, then the very power that makes our prayers possible is gone, and then prayer is useless as a result of that. And I think this is a great example here in verse 19, where you have Paul's optimism and hope and faith in prayer, and he sees the two components of it that lend to the success of prayers, and sometimes we're just not good at those. Art?
Part of our faith is to know that God has our best interests at heart.
Always.
We don't always know what He's going to do. We need to pray that we do that in accordance with His will.
And I think the faith is not selfishly that God will always do what I want Him to do, but I think you're exactly right, that we have faith that God is good and He will answer my prayer and your prayer in exactly the way that it needs to be answered. But He will do something in response to prayer that He wouldn't have done if I did not pray, and He will always do that. And so Paul gives us a great example here. All right, number 2. Verse 20. What was Paul willing to accept? All right, so you read this passage and you look carefully. What was he willing to accept? And what was it? Life or death, okay. What should be the attitude behind every request we make to God, and why was Paul so willing to accept a no answer if that's what God decided? Listen to verse 20 again. According to my earnest expectation and hope that in nothing I shall be ashamed, but with all boldness as always, so now also Christ will be magnified in my body, whether by life or by death. All right? And as Bobby said, what he was willing to accept was the answer that God gave, whether the answer was you're going to die or I'm going to save you out of death. But he was willing to accept that either way. Now, in verse 20, at the very beginning, he talks about his earnest expectation. His earnest expectation, which the word means to turn the head away from and watch for, right? He's taken his eyes off one thing and he's put his eyes on another thing. But what he's talking about is here his hope, right? He's talking about his hope that in nothing he'll be ashamed. I thought Dennis did a good job Wednesday night when talking about hope, how sometimes our use of it is not it's not biblical. It's not based on the Bible definition of it, but he was talking about how it's a confident expectation of eternal salvation. And Paul has this confident expectation. And what he's confident is, in verse 20, is that he would not be ashamed. He would not be ashamed. This is what I don't know. I read a little bit on this week, and there are some who made the argument that what he was not ashamed in would be his appeal before Caesar, right? So he made all these appearances before, Felix and Agrippa, and he made marvelous defenses in those moments of Christianity. And Paul is saying, I'm also confident, perhaps, that when I make my appeal before Caesar and I'll stand before the king of Rome, the emperor of Rome, that my defense of the gospel will be equally as powerful, because he made Felix tremble when he did that, made Agrippa question his own standing with God. And Paul is saying something to the effect now possibly that I'm expecting the same outcome when I do that perhaps before Caesar. But either way, he's saying I'm confident that I'm going to defend the Lord based on that. And he was willing to do this in his body. And as Bobby just mentioned, to be in the body here means whether I make my defense through my death in martyrdom or whether I make my defense in living through this, either way, the Lord is going to be glorified. So this means that Paul was willing to accept death if that's what was to be the outcome. And his willingness was based on one thing in this passage. To either to die for the Lord or to live for the Lord was based on what? The one thing that he knew would be accomplished as a result of either his death or his life. What was the expectation here? That Christ would be magnified, that Christ would be glorified. And what an attitude that is, that I'm willing to accept whatever outcome because I know in the end the Lord gets glorified either by my life or by my death. And so in the Bible, interestingly, the body becomes the medium through which Christ is glorified. Now, obviously, we use our heart, but that flows out of the body. And so we read in passages like 1 Corinthians 6:21 that you are not your own, but that you were bought with a price, right? So it's talking about our body, how our body belongs to the Lord. Romans, I think 6, it might be verse 13 or 14 there, where he's talking about when we come up from the grave of baptism, right? We're raised from the grave of baptism. He says, now use your instruments as instruments of righteousness, meaning you use your body to glorify God. So what we do to glorify God comes through our body, and it's either through active service or through death. But either way, the end result is that Christ would be magnified. So if Paul lived, it would magnify Christ through his deliverance, because Jesus would be the power behind that. Or if he died, it would magnify Christ through Paul's martyrdom, because he would have died because he was a preacher of the gospel. Either way, Christ gets the glory. Any thoughts on that? This passage reminded me a lot of, when you're reading Revelation, one of the underlying themes of the Revelation is that God is bringing vengeance on the people who martyred his saints. And several times it talks about the people who were martyred because of their faith in Jesus Christ. And Paul is put in a position now where he's literally facing down the possibility of being martyred for his faith, but he knows that whether he keeps on living for the Lord or he dies for the Lord, either way, there's a great outcome, and one of the outcomes is going to be that the Lord gets magnified. Now, this is my favorite part of the whole passage right here. Verses 21 through 24. It's the dilemma that Paul finds himself in. And it's not the worst dilemma, right? This is a good position to be in. But he finds himself in a dilemma. We want to talk about the dilemma. What is it? And then how would this attitude change our lives? And how sometimes does the fear of death prevent us from truly living? Now listen carefully to what his dilemma is, verse 21. For to me, to live is Christ, and to die is gain. If I live on in the flesh, this will mean fruit from my labor, yet what I shall choose I cannot tell, for I'm hard-pressed between the two, having a desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is far better. Nevertheless, to remain in the flesh is more needful for you. What is Paul's dilemma? Yeah.
If he's going to stay and work with them, then he's not going to be with Christ.
That's right.
If he goes to be with Christ,
yeah,
he's not going to stay and work with them. So there's a negative because of which
to either side, yes. And he even uses the older languages. He's caught betwixt two things. He's caught in between two positions that he desires so much, and he doesn't know which. He even says it down in verse. I think it's verse 23, isn't it? In verse 22, when he says, what I shall choose, I can't tell. I don't know what to pick because I don't know which is. They're both great. The ends of this are both great, to stay with you and work with you, or to go to be with the Lord, and I just can't choose between the two, but it was a real dilemma. So let's do this. Let's look in the passage now, and let's look at the things Paul says would benefit if he lived, and then let's look at the things he said would benefit if he died. So let's look at the to live part. Verse 21. In verse 21, what's the benefit of living? For to me to live is what? It's Christ. All right, that's number one. What does he mean by that? Okay, yeah, preaching the gospel. Okay, if you read the bulk of Paul's letters, Especially like Galatians, where you get to Galatians 2. He said, I'm crucified with Christ. Nevertheless, I live, yet not I, but Christ lives in me. His whole life was who? The Lord. It was Christ, right? So if he got to live, then that's more time it's more time that he would continue to let Christ live in him. That's a good thing. That's a really good thing. So there's one thing that would happen, because Paul lived to serve the Lord, and Paul's life was so consumed with love for the Lord that would keep on happening if Paul lived. That's one good benefit of keeping on living.
Another thing is how Paul dealt with different congregations.
Yeah.
He's not only preaching the gospel, but handling problems
Yes.
that came up in.
And that's what he's talking about in verse 24. All right? So let's go ahead and add that to the list since Tom is mentioning that. Drop down to verse 24. He says, nevertheless, to remain in the flesh, that's to keep on living. What's the second benefit? It's more needful for you. And Tommy, I think you were just right on the spot there when he was saying that Paul was actually helping those churches, right? So he would help the Philippians, but he would also help church in Rome and the church in Thessalonica and Colossae and all these congregations, Derbe, Lystra, Iconium, all these places where there were congregations. And when Paul would go there or write letters to them, it was really important for Paul to be a part of their life, especially to help them navigate through problems. So to stay on earth was really helpful to the churches. So that's a good thing. So Paul says the second thing is that it's more needful for you, okay? There's also a third thing that would come out of it. Look at verse 22. If Paul stayed on earth, what's the third advantage of staying on the earth? Fruit from my labor. What would fruit here be, perhaps? As he spreads the gospel, what's happening? He's helping people enter the kingdom of the Lord. He's helping people obey the gospel. So Paul is saying, look, this is a tough choice, because if I stay here on earth, then I keep on getting to live for the Lord. I keep getting on to show my love for him through my life, and I'm helping to convert people, and there's a benefit to the churches. Those are all pretty persuasive reasons why he would want to stay on earth. And he did want to stay on the earth, okay? But to die, right? To die, there's some advantage too. So look back at verse 21. To die is what? Is gain. What's the word gain mean there?
Heaven.
It means heaven. The word literally means profitable. It's the word used in other passages to mean lucrative. You're gaining something off of this, right? So Paul said, it is actually profitable for me to die. And like Gloria said, for the reason that he would get to go to heaven, that he would have an eternal reward waiting for him. And in verse 23, if you drop down to verse 23, he said, I'm hard-pressed between the two, having desire to depart and to be with Christ, which is what? Okay, so going to be with the Lord, for all the reasons he said staying here on the earth would be good, it's actually far better to go and be with the Lord. Why is it far better than all the good reasons that he gave for staying on earth? Art?
A lot of times we face death and the issue of death, and we worry about it, and we're really concerned about it. But we should be. I don't know if there's the balance point there, but if we're a Christian, hey.
I know it. Should we be confident in, should we believe that for all the good that we can do for the Lord, living for him and producing fruit and helping each other, those are all really great things. Should we be convinced that it's actually better to go be with the Lord? Yeah, because it is. It's better to go be with the Lord. Tommy?
Well, that's kind of my point. And in fact, what we see in Paul is the utmost confidence that he had in his future state.
Oh, yeah. So certain of it. Yeah.
A lot of times people, if you ask them, are you going to heaven? Will you go to heaven if you die? They'll say, well, I hope so.
Yeah.
So,
But they use that in the remote sense, that they're not sure. We use hope in a sort of an unconfident sense. That's not the way the Bible uses it. Like you're saying, Paul knew that it was the case because he knew he was doing the right thing. And there's that confidence that we should all have. But it's tough. In fact, in verse 23, he says, I'm hard-pressed, and it literally means to be pressed in on both sides. And Paul is presenting the word picture like he's wedged between these two positions, and he doesn't know which way to turn. And ultimately, who's he going to commit that decision to? Yeah, he's going to leave the decision to the Lord, but he personally doesn't know because he can see, like Joel was saying, he can see the advantage of both sides, and to have one but not the other means he's losing out on the advantage of the side that he didn't get. So it's a really tough decision for Paul. Now here's the problem. How do we often view death? As a disadvantage. We often see it as a disadvantage. And when we do that, what's the counter effect of that? What's the backflow of that into the way we make decisions in life? Does it affect the way we live? It affects the way we live so that sometimes we're not really truly living because we're so scared of what we believe death is as a disadvantage. There are times when we find ourselves too entirely tied to this life. But usually because we've grown accustomed to physical satisfactions, right? We like the comforts of this life. And we're warned about that all through Scripture. But to be with the Lord is, in the actual language, it would be translated something like in verse 23, very far better. And we've got to be convinced of that I'm going to do the most I can for the Lord while I'm here, and I'm going to try to help the people that I can while I'm here, and try to convert souls while I'm here, and live for Him. But if I get to go be with the Lord, that is so much better than what I've got going on here. And until we be convinced of that, we can't be like Paul was, willing to say, whatever the Lord chooses, whether it's by my death or by my life, then He's going to be glorified. We can't get there unless we're convinced that it's very far better to go to heaven. That's why I love this, because it's challenging for all of us, especially when we get tied to the comforts of this life, to think that there's an advantage in death. But for a Christian, there is an advantage in death. There is an advantage in death. Any thoughts on that? Very motivating section, I think.
One thing I think of, that's the reason why our treasure should be in heaven, not on earth.
Yeah, Matthew 6:19-20. You got to lay them there, because if it's on earth, then the desire for heaven, you might have it, but it might not be that burning desire like Paul had, which is so good if I get to go. It's actually better if I get to go be with the Lord. So we got to have that. All right, number 4. What was Paul's goal for the church in Philippi in verses 25 and 26? And how would we apply this individually and as a congregation? And what are things that we can do to help both areas? So verse 25, he said, being confident of this, I know that I shall remain and continue with you for your progress and joy in the faith, and that your rejoicing for me may be more abundant in Jesus Christ by my coming to you again. What did he know was going to be the results of his efforts? What is it? Yeah, what he really was expecting was their growth in Christ. And you see it right at the end. He says, I know that I'm going to remain and continue with you for all your progress and joy of faith. He was really expecting that. And what's interesting, he uses the word confident here, which is the word that means calculating the possibilities, the probabilities of something. So in Paul's mind, he's calculating the probabilities, and he's adding up all the things that have added to the sum, and he knows the end result is going to be the growth of these Christians in Philippi. He was confident that he would stay, to stay would serve a good purpose for the Philippians and for others in this passage, not just for them, but for others, for their progress and joy in the faith. Progress means their advancement. Joy here was their gladness in the faith, and of course the faith is the gospel. And so for Paul, everything is centered upon and aimed at the gospel in Christianity. And that's the one thing I think we've seen through chapter 1 so far, is that for Paul, everything was the gospel. The defense of the gospel, their growth in the gospel, his preaching of the gospel, everything was centered on the gospel. Would it be fair to say that Paul's passion in life was the truth? He loved the truth. He loved it. He loved preaching it. He loved hearing it. He loved being around it. He loved the author of it. He just loved the truth. And according to verse 26, if Paul were able to be with them again, it would be a cause for them to rejoice greatly. So here are two things that we should project as goals for Christians. One is progress in the faith. Should all of us try to have, in verse 25, progress in the faith? Advancement in the faith. How do we do that? How do we get there? What can we do? Okay, study is a big one. There's no way to progress in the faith if we're not studying the faith and know the faith. So one thing is we've got to We've got to study it, and along with that, apply it. And when we make mistakes, correct those mistakes and learn from it so that we can be better people as God tells us. But all of that is important. Spiritual growth and development is important for Christianity. It's one of the things we have to have. But there's also something that comes along with that. As we progress in the faith, what also begins to advance, according to the second thing? Our joy. And if you find somebody who is a bitter, caustic person who claims to be a mature Christian, something is not jiving there, right? Because as you advance in the faith, your joy advances in the faith. Those two things go together because the faith is the foundation of our happiness, and we find joy in truth just like Paul, and he wanted that for the people as well. Now, individually, it's already been mentioned, we can study a healthy prayer life. We got to pray, and sometimes we don't pray like we ought, but that's got to be part of it. We can be winsome and evangelistic. That's part of having this advancement in the faith. Being involved, we had a whole series in January about getting involved and pushing ourselves beyond our comfort zones. That's all individually. Those are things we can do to be advancing in the faith and having joy. And then congregationally, we need elders, right? And we do have them who feed the word to the people, right? They're feeding the flock the word. We got to have evangelism, participation, and efforts for the truth, but we've got to be involved in a life of truth. And if we do, then just like Paul did and like the Philippians did, we have advancement and joy in the truth. Anything else in this passage? Yeah, Tommy?
I think what we neglect to think about is becoming wiser. We should have the desire every day to become smarter in life in general.
Yeah.
Also, as we mentioned, study of Scripture and application of what we read and study and learn. But also, there has to be a concerted effort to be smarter, not prideful.
Right, sure.
But just become more aware of things and how to handle things. Because we live in a very complex world now, and, we're confronted with things every day that we've never experienced. And for us to be able to handle those things, we have to think upon those.
That's right.
And try to connect them with what the Bible says and how we handle things.
Yeah, and that's the difference between what Paul would talk about in chapter 3, between a mature person and someone who's not. It's easy you can read a Bible verse, but it has to be applied. And as you experience life, you start to layer that on top of, your character, and it becomes, you get seasoned as a result of that. And I think that's an excellent point. And we should be. If I can't look back and say, I've learned these lessons and I'm better off here than I was right here. If I'm the same as I was, something's wrong. I've got to be better as I go along. That's advancement in the faith. But that's what happens if we dedicate ourselves to a life of truth, which Paul did and wanted for the Philippians as well. It's a great point. I love that section because I think if all of us are treating life as it should be treated, then all of us are kind of in that position of being caught between two positions that we love. I love being with my brethren and helping on earth and trying to do the Lord's will and being the best I can for Him, but I want to go to heaven too. And if I'm treating that situation correctly, then I see the advantages of both and a disadvantage if I don't get the one and get stuck with the other, like Joel was saying, because it is a dilemma that Paul found himself in. He really wanted to be with the Lord, but he also really wanted to be with the saints here upon the earth and do the Lord's work. So, beautiful section, challenging section for us. All right. Verse 27 through chapter 2, verse 4 is Paul saying, I want you all to have one mind. I want unity in the church there at Philippi. I want unity in the church. How could we possibly do that since the church is made up of so many varying minds? How do we get to unity in the church? And he's going to tell us how we do that in the next section. I'll look forward to your comments. Thank you guys so much. We'll put a peg in it here. Appreciate it.